Hello everybody, I'm Silleaf. This will be the one-shot entitled Consequences of Timing, written and read by me. Summary. After Izuku makes it back to the battlefield that had become of UA skybase, he finds his childhood friend on the ground, bloody and motionless. His whole body became nothing more than static as he tried to help out his Kacchan, but nothing seemed to be working. Or, what if Edgeshot couldn't help Bakugou during the final war and Mirio didn't get to Midoriya fast enough? Izuku reached his hands out, conjuring Black Whip to wrap around the fallen debris of the battlefield. The dark tendrils reached, each one latching onto the broken pieces of the battleground, wrapping around them like vines that snaked across the rough terrain. The Quirk dug into the rock and dirt, sinking into them as if they were roots of a tree. Midoriya's Quirk pulled, causing the muscles in his arms to strain with effort in order to control his trajectory. The struggle was worth it, though, as the dark Quirk began to draw him down and bring him closer to the ground, and into Shigaraki's proximity. Wind whipped through his curls and his ears, as his speed was redirected in a straight downwards pull. Without missing a beat, he readied himself to deliver a powerful kick aimed at the villain below. Izuku's focus was sharp and his determination unyielding as he neared the ground and braced himself for the impact. Shigaraki turned, the mix of hands and limbs on his body pausing as he caught sight of the Quirk. The villain locked eyes with the greenette. His teeth gritted behind the hands before a wide grin was etched onto his cheeks, old wounds being cracked open. The teen's steel boots collided with Tomura's face with a sickening crunch, causing the limbs around the shoes to dissipate. His knees bent to push off afterwards, and furthermore, to absorb the impact. The force of the collision was enough to send the villain stumbling back before the older man's body was flying across the battlefield, as if he were a rag doll. As Midoriya skidded to a stop, he swiftly recalled his Quirk, making the tendrils of darkness retract back to him and disappear from sight. He took a moment to catch his breath, panting heavily as he turned to face the scene before him, his mouth opening with a huff as he went to speak. "Sorry I'm late," his words trailed off, mouth going slack and dry as his Viridian eyes saw the carnage of his absence. The sight that greeted the teen was one of devastation. The heroes who had been there to aid him lay scattered across the battleground, their bodies battered and bloodied. Mirio was slumped against a tree trunk, her once fierce form now slack and stained with crimson. Next to her, Edgeshot was motionless, the usually formidable hero unmoving and defeated. Midoriya's heart sank as he took in the scene, the weight of the battle resting heavily upon him. The allies who were once there to support him now lay injured and beaten, their efforts seemingly in vain. Izuku's gaze wandered across the battlefield, taking in everything around him. His heart seemed to skip a beat as his eyes landed on a familiar head of spiky blonde hair, its once vibrant color now tinted red as it lay on the ground. The greenette's world seemed to freeze at that moment, and all sounds faded into the background as his focus zeroed in on the motionless figure. Midoriya's fists clenched tightly as he stared at the body. He focused only on the form, his heart sinking as the gravity of the situation dawned upon him. The weight of the battle and the sacrifice that had been clearly made was overwhelming. His breath picked up, his heart beating fast. "Do you need to give your excuse for being late?" the villain's voice said distantly, but Izuku paid it no mind, taking a small step forward. "Why don't you avoid taking responsibility like those other guys?" The teen's feet felt heavy as he approached the body that owned the bloody hair, his heart racing with desperation. The sight of the usually vibrant and loud figure, now limp and silent, was more than he could bear. He could feel his heart thumping rapidly in his chest as his breath quickened. His body trembled from the adrenaline coursing through him, but despite it all, Midoriya forced himself to move closer, his mind racing with a million thoughts, each one more troubling than the last. With each step he took, the weight of the situation bore heavily upon him, the consequences of the battle becoming more and more apparent. "Why don't you say it?" the voice filtered in slightly. "It couldn't be helped." The sound paused, the ground rumbling as the person speaking took a step. "I didn't expect it either." Izuku's feet stopped just by the body's side, not paying any mind to the Gene hero next to the bloody mess. The teen's eyes softened as he stared down at his childhood friend, his heart heavy. Silence hung in the air, a faint ringing in his ears as widened green eyes moved carefully, slowly, across the limpen form. His whole body felt numb, like static coursing through him, buzzing and waiting. It didn't feel real. "Kacchan?" he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Bakugou didn't answer. His usual explosive energy was extinguished and replaced by pure silence. Midoriya could see the blood staining his uniform, a stark reminder of the battle he had just endured. A mix of grief and worry washed over Izuku as he knelt down beside his friend, reaching out to check his pulse. Before his hand could reach the dirtied skin, though, he paused as more red caught in the corner of his eye. His hand hovered over the blonde's neck, his gaze drifting to the bloody hole in his chest, and the teen's heart sank even further, the true severity of the injury hitting him like a tongue of bricks. He could feel his own breath hitching in his chest as he took in the sight, his mind reeling with a mix of shock and denial. Midoriya's hand trembled as he slowly moved it to his friend's gaping wound. Izuku's touch was feather-light as his hand touched the gaping hole in Bakugou's chest, his body shaking. The wound was deep and brutal, a jagged tear that stretched across the entire width of his chest. The teen's eyes stung as he stared down at the gruesome injury, his brain trying to process the severity of it. Blood pooled from the injury, staining the ground and Kacchan's costume in a dark crimson hue. Midoriya bit his lip, his mind racing with a million thoughts, each one more desperate than the last. He could see things he wasn't supposed to, smell the taint of iron. It wasn't right. The kid's hand shook, nails digging into the tattered fabric. There was no way for anyone to recover from an injury like that. "Kacchan? No," Midoriya whispered, his lips trembling as he struggled to keep his composure, his heart clenching painfully in his chest. As he stared at the bloody spot, he knew that there was nothing he could do to change what had happened. The greenette's hands were shaking as he pressed down on the injury with gentle yet desperate pressure, muttering incoherently as tears welled up in his eyes. The air around him grew thick with purple smoke, tendrils of black withering from his body like protective vines. The Quirk seemed to grow more and more unstable, like they were reacting to the intense emotions that were coursing through him. Midoriya's breathing became ragged as he tried to control himself, but the tears kept coming, streaming down his face in a steady flow. I'm sorry, Kacchan. I'm sorry." He blinked, willing the tears to go away and make his vision clearer. If he just would have gotten here sooner. Midoriya's words were lost in a desperate stream of apologies, his voice choked with emotion as he tried to keep the tears at bay. Each word was punctuated by a ragged gasp as he tried to stifle his sobs, the weight of guilt and despair crashing down on him. He closed his eyes tightly, willing himself to regain control, but it was a futile effort. The tears kept falling, blurring his vision and making it harder to focus on the task at hand. "Please move. Get up, Kacchan." The tendrils of black swarmed around Midoriya and Kacchan, encircling them in a protective barrier and creating a shield that blocked out the outside world. The nearby hero was pushed back by the tendrils' possessive nature, but it was the furthest thing from Midoriya's mind. All that mattered to him was saving his friend. It'll be okay. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have left you. He paused, swallowing thickly as he looked back to the blonde's face. He then spoke with wavering determination, a sad smile bracing his face. "Stay still, okay? He looked down at the wound, blinking strongly and allowing the smile to fade. "Just stay still." Izuku's focus was entirely on trying to help the bloody blonde, his hands moving with a sense of urgency as he tried to do something, anything to save him. The protective nature of Black Whip grew more and more agitated, as if they were reacting to Midoriya's desperation. The tendrils slowly grew more possessive, coiling around Deku and Kacchan like vines, and snaring them both in a tight embrace. His mind raced as he tried to think of anything that could help, but his thoughts were consumed by panic and denial. It was like a fog had settled over his brain, making it impossible to think straight. All he could do was stare down at Kacchan's unmoving body, the tears still streaming down his face. The dark quirk around them grew even more aggressive, curling tighter around them as if it were trying to keep the world at bay. The greenet was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions, his thoughts spiraling out of control. He couldn't focus on anything except his desperation to save his friend. The tendrils of black around them coiled tighter and tighter, like a python squeezing its prey. Midoriya was oblivious to everything else around him, his mind consumed by the task at hand. The tears kept flowing, his vision blurry and distorted. Each moment felt like an eternity, each breath feeling like a battle in and of itself. The boy tried to force himself to calm down, but it was like he was drowning in a sea of his own emotions, with Black Whip and his other quirks as a constant presence around him, a silent witness to his pain and anger. Midoriya felt utterly and completely helpless. The greenet shut his eyes tightly, urgently trying to think of what to do. He knew that he had to stay focused and find a solution, but the emotions that were coursing through him made it impossible to think clearly. It was like his mind was caught in a loop, replaying the same thoughts over and over again. The tendrils around them moved closer to Izuku's own body, winding together, their presence almost suffocating as they reacted to his sorrow. The teen opened teary eyes, the action looking almost forceful. His gaze flicked towards Shigaraki. The One-for-All user hated the fact that he was in this situation because of himself and his worthlessness, but couldn't deny that the person locked in his vision was partially to blame. He felt a wave of anger and loathing wash over him as the dark whips around him reacted, coiling tighter and growing more possessive as they responded to his emotions. "Hold on, Kacchan." Midoriya slowly stood up, his legs trembling slightly as he lifted his hands from Kacchan's chest. The blood dripped from his fingers to the ground below, staining the dirt a dark crimson. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as Black Whip moved to rest around his body, but this time, it seemed more controlled. Despair still simmered just beneath the surface, however, anger did too. Only this time, he had something to aim it at. Izuku clenched his fist tightly, knuckles turning white as his gaze locked onto the fully recovered Shigaraki. The anger and despair that had been building within him now had an outlet, and he channeled it towards the villain with a single-minded purpose. He needed to protect Kacchan as best as possible, but to do that, he needed to get rid of the danger as soon as possible. The greenet wheeled heavy feet forward, his mind going blank. He tilted forward slightly before launching forward, the ground cracking underneath his feet as he activated gear shift to aid his pursuit. Kacchan would be fine if he took care of this first. Right? One of Tomura's many limbs reached out, the gross mix of hands aiming for Izuku's chest. Midoriya instinctively reacted to Shigaraki's attack, his eyes narrowing in anger. He lashed out with Black Whip, wrapping it tightly around the villain's wrist and pulling it away from his torso. There was a sickening crunch as his wrist bent awkwardly, causing Tomura to let out a pained cry. Izuku could feel his own blood pumping furiously in time with his heart, the adrenaline coursing through his veins like a potent drug. His gaze remained locked on the villain, the anger and guilt within him condensing into a single focus point. The tendrils moved around him, almost like they were preparing to lunge forward at the villain. The tension in the air was palpable, as if it were building towards a breaking point. Shigaraki, even in his injured state, was not one to back down from a fight. With a snarl of anger, he lashed out with his remaining limbs, aiming to strike at Midoriya's form from different directions. Despite his wounds, the villain's movements were still fast and precise, his limbs moving with a deadly grace. Izuku had to remain on high alert, his attention split in multiple directions as he tried to keep track of the villain's every move. The moment one darted a little too close for comfort, he twisted his body to avoid it, his hands reaching out and grabbing onto the limb with staggering strength. The greenette grit his teeth with the effort in holding onto the large mix of arms and hands. Dark vines snaked around the limb before squeezing. Tomura growled and swiftly delivered a punch to Izuku's stomach. Izuku went flying, his body going limp in the air before bending backwards around a nearby rock. He slumped to the ground with a groan, pain lacing his spine. Shigaraki, seizing the advantage gained from the punch, wasted no time in advancing towards Midoriya. He approached the fallen teen with a feral grin, his eyes gleaming with bloodthirsty ammunition. As he drew closer, his limbs tensed in anticipation, their movements betraying his desire to finish the battle swiftly and decisively. The air around them crackled with intensity, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath in suspense. Izuku pushed himself up to his hands and knees, sniffling as tears fell to the dirt below with faint pats. He was crying again, not from the pain but from the mix of worthlessness and anger. He looked up to Shigaraki, his lungs straining as gear shift began to wear off. The villain was close now, towering over him like a menacing presence. Despite the pain and exhaustion, the teen could feel the anger and despair coursing through him, mixing with a sense of hopelessness and self-doubt. Shigaraki's eyes gleamed with pitiless amusement as he took in the sight of the fallen teen, his movements betraying a wicked sense of satisfaction.
"How do you like my present, Midoriya Izuku?"
the villain said, the corners of his lips curling up in a sadistic grin. The teen grits his teeth before launching up, pushing gear shift to keep aiding him in the fight. The tears in his eyes were making his vision blurry beyond belief, but he didn't care. Shigaraki's twisted amusement grew even more intense as he saw Midoriya suddenly push himself up, relying on gear shift to keep his body functioning. The teen's movements were shaky and desperate, the tears in his eyes further hindering his vision. The villain's eyes portrayed cruel excitement as he prepared for the incoming attack. He raised one of his massive limbs, its grotesque form ready to knock the teen back to the ground. Izuku darted forward, closing the distance between him and Shigaraki in the blink of an eye. Despite the tears in his vision, he could still make out the villain's movements, his instincts and danger sense guiding him onward. As he reached the villain, he twisted his body to avoid the incoming limb, sidestepping the attack with a grace he didn't know he possessed. Before Tomura could even register what happened, the greenette's fist landed on the villain's chest, delivering an impact that sent him stumbling back several meters. Midoriya's face was a mess of anger and despair, his tears now mixed in with the intensity of the battle. His body trembled with the effort, but he refused to give in. Shigaraki's smile faltered for only a brief moment as he was sent flying back, surprise flashing across his face. He quickly regained his footing, his expression hardening once again. With a snarl of anger, Tomura launched forward, his limbs lashing out in a fury of attacks. Izuku was able to dodge and counter most of the blows, but the villain's strength and speed were difficult to keep up with. The teen fought back with the same intensity, his movements becoming more and more desperate as the battle raged on. Each impact sent shockwaves through the arena, the sounds of fists connecting ringing out like a macabre song. In a moment of desperation, Izuku found an opening in the villain's defense. With a sharp twist of his body, he dove under the villain's flailing limbs and landed a solid uppercut to Shigaraki's chin. The villain was sent reeling, his expression one of shock and surprise. For a brief moment, the one-for-all user had the upper hand. The teen didn't let up, using the momentum from his previous attack to land several quick blows to the villain's chest and flanks. Shigaraki growled in pain, his movements becoming more sloppy and uncontrolled. As the greenette prepared for the final blow, he suddenly felt a sharp and crippling pain in his chest. He tried to gasp for air, but his lungs refused to cooperate, as if they were suddenly paralyzed. His limbs trembled, and he felt himself stagger to the side, completely immobilized by the sudden onset of shortness of breath. His attacks and movements came to a halt as he desperately tried to catch his breath, fighting against a sense of panic that threatened to overcome him. He wheezed, stumbling back and reaching a shaking hand up to grab at his tattered scarf in the front of his costume. The world seemed to spin around him as he stumbled back, gasping and wheezing for air. His vision began to blur and his ears rang as his heart pounded erratically in his chest. The pain in his chest was excruciating, as if his lungs were refusing to function properly. Midoriya clenched at his shirt, trying to take in a deep breath, but it was as if every cell in his body was rebelling against him. His panicked mind raced with thoughts of fear and confusion. The adrenaline that had sustained him now left his body weak and shaky. The greenette felt his legs give out from under him as he tripped back and fell onto his rear. He couldn't seem to get any air into his lungs, no matter how hard he tried. Each desperate gasp only brought him a shuddering cough, which only seemed to make him more exhausted and panicked. He clawed at his neck, trying to loosen the scarf. The fabric felt like a constricting vice around his throat. Izuku's thoughts were clouded with confusion and fear as he struggled against the feeling of suffocation that seemed to be closing in on him. In a desperate attempt to ease the pain in his chest, Midoriya shifted his body onto his side, resting his forehead against the cool ground beneath him as his eyes shut tightly. The rough dirt felt solid and grounding against his skin, contrasting with the turbulent emotions whirring within him. He tried to focus on the sensation of the earth beneath him, desperate to distract himself from the feeling of slowly suffocating. His breath came in short, labored gasps, and each one seemed to require a Herculean effort. He took in a pointless breath, the motion not allowing anything to get into his lungs, before it was all huffed out and the teen was sent flying into a tree with a sickening crunch. He slumped against the trunk, dazed, his vision hazy and unfocused. Everything was a blur, and he couldn't seem to catch his breath. Through the daze, he could barely make out the figure of Shigaraki approaching, the villain's expression unreadable in Midoriya's impaired state. He wheezed, his body straining with effort. As Shigaraki loomed over him, Izuku felt the deformed hand of the villain grab at his head. He tried to struggle, but his body was too weakened and overwhelmed to do anything. And then a sensation of emptiness overcame him. It was a strange but familiar feeling, as if a vital part of himself was simply snatched away. He knew instantly that Shigaraki had stolen his quirk using All for One. Once the hand was pulled back, tears streamed down his face freely, and his head slumped forward, dirty curls curtaining his eyes. He had been too weak to fight back against Shigaraki. He failed, all because he couldn't get the side effects of his quirk under control. His brain fogged over as he tried to move, to do anything. He needed to save Kacchan. Midoriya felt a wave of despair wash over him as he found himself utterly defenseless and exhausted. He was quirkless again, the ability he had worked so hard to obtain taken away in an instant. He hated it. The greenette's clouded Viridian eyes moved to his childhood friend's limp form that lay just a few yards away. He continued to look at the tuft of crimson blonde, the gaze drowning out the suffocating feeling. For some reason, he was getting tired. The teen, unable to move or fight back, felt his strength waning rapidly. His eyelids felt heavy, his body sluggish and unresponsive. Izuku was exhausted, drained both physically and mentally, his body crying out for rest. He could rest, right? With his strength fading fast, Izuku pushed himself to the side with a grunt, shutting his eyes momentarily from the pain. Once they reopened, he clawed at the ground, desperately pulling his body to try and get into his childhood friend's proximity. He could feel the burning in his empty lungs that his movements were causing. With each weakened drag that pulled his battered body across the rough terrain, it caused his muscles to scream out in pain. However, he couldn't stop. He needed to get to Kacchan. He needed to protect him. Once the mangled arm of the blonde was somewhat in reach, Midoriya reached out with withering strength. He trembled with the exertion, fingers desperately stretching to at least touch the other boy. The tips of the greenette's fingers brushed along Kacchan's arm, just beneath the shoulder, before his arm dropped to the ground, his head as well. He closed his eyes, the exhaustion becoming too much for his frail and weakened form. With one final wheeze, his mind slowed down, the last image he saw being the familiar sight of Bakugou's unmoving form, and one last thought coursed through his mind at that moment. I'm sorry, Kacchan. Alright, everybody, that concludes the one-shot entitled Consequences of Timing. Please make sure to check out the Discord if you haven't already. If you would like to get updates easier, get connected with people within the fanfiction community, make requests for a podfic, and more. The link to the server will be in the description. Now I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for listening.